Welcome to this program in the Our Finger Lakes History Series. I am Seneca County Historian Walter Gable. The topic of this program is the freezing of the various Finger Lakes. Shown here is an aerial photo taken on March 6, 2015. In this aerial photo, you can clearly see that of the 11 Finger Lakes that comprise the Finger Lakes, only the two largest of these lakes, Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake, are not completely frozen over. You will note, however, that much of Cayuga Lake does appear to be frozen over. This is especially true for the very northern part of Cayuga Lake, which happens to be very shallow. That last comment leads me to make this general statement to help explain why most of the Finger Lakes freeze over each year, but not Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake. If you look at the chart at left, you will see the maximum depth of the various Finger Lakes and the total surface area of each lake. The point to be made from looking at this data is that Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake are the two deepest Finger Lakes. Because of the deepness of these lakes, these two lakes have seldom frozen over. Seneca and Cayuga Lakes resist freezing over because they are deep, voluminous lakes relative to their surface areas, and winds keep mixing the 39 degrees temperature water of the lake with 32 degrees water on the surface. So only the shallow areas, especially the northern 10 miles of Cayuga Lake, cool off enough to freeze first. It takes an extensive period of frigid, still air for a successful layer of ice to form. Cold temperatures can cause a thin layer of ice to form, but wind can break up these thin ice sheets. So there has to be an extended period of frigid cold without wind for these two deep Finger Lakes to freeze over. Seneca and Cayuga Lakes are simply too deep, especially compared to their surface area, to freeze over every year. The lakes retain heat so well. I thank Professor Neil Laird of Hobart and William Smith Colleges for the following explanation of the relative depth to surface area for this freezing phenomenon. He used the example, think of a tall coffee cup compared to putting the same amount of coffee in a bowl. The coffee in the tall coffee cup will retain its warmth better than the same amount of coffee in that bowl. I also want to point out that the ability of the deep Finger Lakes to store and release heat is why the region has so many vineyards. The lakes modify the climate, keeping the areas around the lakes several degrees warmer in the winter than they otherwise would be. In the summer, the lakes are much slower to heat up than the land, so the water helps cool the surrounding air. In this visual, I just emphasized the key points for freezing over of Cayuga or Seneca Lake: intensely cold weather and lack of winds for a prolonged period of time. Now, when we talk about a frozen over lake, there may well be some air holes, such as the one that is shown in this visual, in what we would otherwise easily consider a lake frozen over. Here you can see that Cayuga Lake has frozen over 9 times since European American whites have been living in the area, compared to only 4 times for Seneca Lake. Cayuga Lake has frozen over an average of less than every 20 years between freezing. But Cayuga Lake has not frozen over since 1979, now a span of over 40 years. There is some speculation that climate warming is a strong candidate to explain this long period without a major ice cover on Cayuga Lake. As for Seneca Lake, there is the joke that people ought to put Seneca Lake water in their car radiators, since Seneca Lake water never freezes over. The freeze-over of Seneca Lake in 1855 started in late February and continued until April 5th. Obviously, the freeze-over kept the steamboats from operating. David Hillerman's diary entry records that the ice was 5 inches thick in the center of Seneca Lake when he measured it. William Kuhn wrote how he and 20 others on February 28, 1855, skated on Seneca Lake from Glen Eldridge to Watkins and back. In early 1856, Cayuga Lake was froze over. The article from the Ovid newspaper shown pointed out that teams of horses were crossing Cayuga Lake on the ice between Kidders and King's Ferry. That same article pointed out that when the normal ferry boat between Kidders and King Ferry couldn't operate because of the ice, a small ice boat was used instead. After all, the mail has to be delivered. Seneca Lake froze over again in 1875. A large group of ice skaters skated from Geneva to Dye's Landing and back. 2 doctors at the Willard Asylum, along with 3 young gentlemen, crossed Seneca Lake on the ice between Willard and Dresden. They found some cracks in the ice. The top quote shown here highlights the rarity of Seneca Lake freezing over. Probably no person watching this video segment has ever experienced a Seneca Lake frozen over. The second quote tells of the tragedy of a young youth being run over by an ice boat, probably going too fast on the ice. Here, the top quote points out that in February 1884, Cayuga Lake was frozen over, but not Seneca Lake. The bottom quote states that in February 1885, Seneca Lake froze over, halting steamboat travel until the 1st of May. Here are some quotes or comments about the situation on Cayuga and Seneca Lakes in the winter of 1884-85. On Cayuga Lake, teams of horses were crossing the lake on March 27th, and apparently the lake still had a freeze-over as late as April 4th. The Busy Bee, in the second comment, was a ferry boat crossing from Kidders to King Ferry, and it was frozen in ice 15 inches thick. On Seneca Lake on February 25th, a grand carnival was held on the ice at Watkins. These pieces of information illustrate that it is possible to have a very thin ice skimming either Seneca Lake or Cayuga Lake in the springtime, as the melting snow cools the surface of the lake sufficiently. Both Seneca and Cayuga Lakes froze over in 1912. January 1912 was very cold, one necessary condition for freezing over. The diary entries of Carrie Coleman point out this situation at Kidders when Cayuga Lake froze over in February 1912. February 16th, she reports, hundreds crossing the lake, skating and walking. Here you see men skating on the ice at Kidders in mid-February 1912. Here is another picture of the large numbers of people gathered on the ice in February 1912. It was a similar situation for Seneca Lake in February 1912. People crossed the lake on the ice. I found the bottom newspaper article particularly interesting. You will note that the men on February 13th cautiously crossed Seneca Lake out of fear that they might not be able to skate all the way across to Willard. But having successfully crossed to Willard, they crossed back to Dresden much faster. Of course, cars were new in 1912, unlike 1885, so people couldn't hesitate to drive their cars out onto the ice of Seneca Lake. Here is another picture of a car on Seneca Lake. This is a 1912 postcard. In the center, the man with his safety pole was Nelson Longstreet, who skated the entire length of Seneca Lake. Of course, snowfall on a frozen over lake can make it difficult for ice skating. Shown here are some frozen Seneca Lake stories that appeared in the Geneva Daily Times issue of February 17, 1912. In the first, you can read that a Mr. Burroughs, who was a junior at Hobart College, skated down the center of Seneca Lake round trip from Geneva to Watkins. William Smith students, of course females, were cautioned not to go on the ice. The third article humorously tells how Edward Gordonier cut a large circle of ice around himself and sank down into the water. The last article tells how many sportsmen were making use of ice boats on Seneca Lake. Here are two more pictures of people on the frozen Seneca Lake in 1912. Don't think for a moment, however, that all people going onto a frozen Finger Lake that they thought was frozen over at least escaped harm. 3 different accidents are described here. The first, Cornell University students, a telegraph operator, and then the missing of 2 men. The breaking up of ice to end of a frozen over lake can have some interesting effects. Typically, there can be large noises as the wind breaks up the ice into large chunks that collide with other ice chunks. This newspaper article points out the strange end to the freeze-over of Seneca Lake in 1912. Earl Shannon used his ice boat on Seneca Lake the morning of March 17th. Then the ice broke up so that he could use his motorboat, not the one shown here. He could use his motorboat that same afternoon. As has been previously stated in this program, Cayuga Lake has frozen over more times than Seneca Lake. Seneca Lake hasn't frozen over since 1912, but Cayuga Lake has frozen over a few times since 1912. One of these times was in 1936. My dad spoke several times about how the group of men described here were skating across Cayuga Lake from East Varick to Aurora. They had an easy skate on the way to Aurora. On the way back, however, the ice was beginning to break up, and the group had to jump over ice cracks that were more than 6 feet wide. Personally, I have experienced being on the frozen over Cayuga Lake 2 different times. The first time happened in 1962, when I was a sophomore in high school. The ice was very clear when we started out walking on it at Red Creek. I loved how one could see the bottom of the lake, but our family pet dog didn't like it a little bit. In 1979, when Cayuga Lake froze over again, the freeze-over was much less clear ice. The ice surface was actually very rough. A few years ago, I confirmed with staff at Wells College that their tradition is still policy to cancel classes the first day that Cayuga Lake has a freeze-over. It has happened in 1912 and 1918, for example. A close call came in 1979, but classes were not canceled. A freeze-over of Cayuga Lake or Seneca Lake, as well as the smaller Finger Lakes, does make for a beautiful sight. Unusual on Cayuga and Seneca Lakes, however. When the smaller Finger Lakes freeze over, and when much of the northern parts of Cayuga Lake freeze over, there are wonderful opportunities for ice fishing. If you look closely in this February 1st, 2009 picture I took on Cayuga Lake, you can see several huts set up for ice fishing. For many years, people even drove their cars out on the ice near Cayuga Lake State Park. This is a 1968 photo provided by George Seth. Cars can no longer do this, however. But we do have people enjoy driving their snowmobiles out on a frozen Finger Lake. I leave you with this last visual of something we don't see anymore: ice boats on Cayuga Lake. I leave you with one last thought. Would you want to see both Cayuga and Seneca Lakes freeze over this winter? What kind of a winter would that mean for us? I hope you have enjoyed this program in the Our Finger Lakes History series.